This conference will now be recorded.
All right, well, welcome out this morning. We are, we're getting together today as part of Believe in Freedom to talk about some of the different things that go on in our country and our daily lives, and to hopefully help us learn a little bit more about these things so that we can take some actions and start to understand how the principles at play in the Constitution affect our decisions in a day-to-day life. So today we'll be talking about the Fourth Amendment. And let's see here, I'll get it up on the screen for you. So the Fourth Amendment is one that is used a lot in our society. This is the Fourth Amendment here. And Elias, could you read that for us?
The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized.
All right, so I'm curious, when you look at this, what are some of the reasons you think the Founding Fathers would have been concerned about these issues and why they'd put them in here in the Constitution? John, what are some of your thoughts on that?
So the king's armies and the king had the ultimate right in many ways. All he needed to do was have, and it wasn't even just the king, it was people acting on behalf of the crown, that it could walk into your house and search through your effects basically at any given time, and they could take anything of yours. In fact, they could come in, live in your house, and you would have to, they could quarter the army, as it were. And so they wanted to make sure that there was government had to come up with something to be able to go about doing that. But the bottom line is that any time the king or one of his representatives could come in your house and go through any of your effects, and you had no recourse, there was nothing to stop them from doing it, and you had to deal with
it. Okay, so certainly in the historical context, we had, like you say, we had these, the king's people coming in. They could just search anything at any time. But people often ask if they, if we're not doing anything wrong, why do we care about that? And why did the Founding Fathers care about it, even if they weren't doing anything wrong necessarily?
Well, wasn't it used inappropriately all the time? If they don't need probable cause, then anyone can be searched anytime. I don't know.
Yeah, no, for sure.
If you look at today's situation, and even it's the same thing of the time, if they come through a search warrant, when the government can come in and search somebody's home, their home's basically torn apart. It can be, walls can be broken. Your house can be totally dismantled. Doors can be broken down. Your whole world, your whole home, or whatever property of yours can be literally taken apart, and that would be, even if you have nothing to hide, just that type of invasion on your home, the same thing as being robbed, basically. There needs to be a level of reason to go about doing so before you enforce that on someone, even if you have nothing to hide.
Okay. Those are all good points.
I think another point would be just to protect them, themselves, right? In a sense that you've got imperfect beings that are, whether it's law enforcement or, whomever is given this authority, that, if that was just the green light was always on and you could, do as you please, I can imagine that power would be abused.
Yeah, for sure.
So I was going to say something, Austin.
Yep, go ahead.
And maybe this is just what the man before me said, restated, but if you get a government that makes it so that you can't have life, liberty, or happiness according to their rules because they're not letting you have a job, or they're not letting you shop unless you get vaccinated, or whatever rules they set that aren't good with your values. It's not that you're, and so maybe you find a way to provide food for yourself and life for yourself, and they consider that illegal, and then they come in to prove that you're like, I don't know, you're somehow making money or trading or something to survive, and they say that you're breaking the rules because you're not allowed to survive unless you do it their way. That would be a reason to not want them coming in and searching, because they're not giving you an opportunity to provide life in a reasonable fashion, and so maybe you have to go underground.
Yeah, and that's a very important issue. It's one that I have in the slides to go through in a little bit of detail to look at some of the things that are happening right now. And to the point, I think that there's two main points to consider with this to understand, I think, a little in depth of what's happening. This amendment, in my opinion, is meant to be a check on the government's power. It's a very important check on the government's power, because even if you haven't done anything wrong, if the government has the ability to just come in and search for something at any given time, then all that they have to do if they don't like you is make a law about something they saw in your home and then come in and inspect and find it. And you can think of, going back historically to Daniel praying in Babylon, the king passes a law. He gets, people wanted Daniel taken down, so they had a law specifically passed. And we look at that and say that's, that might be a little bit crazy, but if you think about our laws today, there's so many tax regulations alone that if the government didn't like you for some reason, or just even policeman, if you crossed paths wrong with a policeman and he didn't like you, then if there was no check on the government power, he could just walk into your house. He could go check out your bank statements. He could go look at everything and say, oh, I found something where you didn't disclose this little bit of income. And almost everyone in America, I'd actually dare to say all of us have at one time or another broken tax laws, just inadvertently. There's so many laws, there's so much power the government has and things they've passed that, again, if you cross paths wrong, look at someone wrong. And while we don't see a ton of that right now, I know that Black people would argue otherwise. They definitely say they get targeted and harassed by the government with these things. But if there was no check whatsoever, there would be a lot of abuse of power against people. And this check, as we look at it, people often say, oh, well, it's okay because I'm not doing anything wrong. But no, it's very much an important principle that we uphold as people, to say, government, when you have power, it corrupts people. And this is a very important check that the founding fathers put in. To the second point that Angela was talking about, laws can become corrupt at some point, where they start to really go down a negative path. And if you're trying to live in a way that you believe is correct, but the laws are heading in another direction, such as, just for example, if they pass a law that says, hey, you can't go give a priesthood blessing to someone because you might spread coronavirus or something like that. These are principles where people might say, I'm called to go give a blessing, and they feel in their heart of hearts they should do something like that. And it does get to a place where we start to get a lot of conflict between people that are trying to live a moral life, and they're not killing people, they're not doing other things, but the laws don't necessarily agree with what they're doing. So those are two things we'll look at here. So with the NSA, we'll go to them. They're kind of a prime example of government looking at data on its citizens. Alan, are you in front of a computer to read that?
Yeah. The NSA opened a new database facility in Utah in 2019. The facility is expected to consume about $40 million worth of electricity per year and about 1.7 million gallons of water per day. The NSA publicly stated that it is not collecting information on U.S. citizens, but leaked documents show otherwise. If the NSA is recording internet and phone activities and content of U.S. citizens, but will never use the data for a criminal prosecution, is the NSA violating the Fourth Amendment?
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on government gathering data on us, even if they never use it for criminal prosecution?
They will not never use it. Eventually, somebody changes, something spectacular happens, like coronavirus, like Google and Apple have already handed over data that they said they would never share with the government to help in the coronavirus fight. I mean, we're all being recorded anyways by private companies. But so I don't think so.
Yeah, so to your point, is it true that they will never use it for criminal prosecution? Highly dubious claim for sure. But what are your other thoughts? Can the government go through and just collect all this stuff? Private companies, we're letting them do it. And we'll get to an issue that's come up where the government's figured out how to circumvent the Fourth Amendment. But what are your thoughts on that?
Did you say me or someone else?
Oh, you can go ahead for sure.
Well, I'm just thinking, I mean, first of all, what a huge waste of resources to gather all this information for something you're not ever going to use. So the taxpayer could be upset just at the waste of money. But of course, there's the deeper issue of I just don't want them having my information. Why should I trust them knowing how power corrupts? Absolutely. But what a waste of taxpayer money.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And you look here in Utah, we're in a desert, and they consume 1.7 million gallons of water per day.
To me, it is in violation of the Fourth Amendment, because they're searching with unprobable, they don't have probable cause. They are not authorized by the Constitution to do so, but they justify it through fourth arm of government, if you will, for security, but does violate the Fourth Amendment.
One question I have for you, Austin, as well is, I mean, what was the reasoning behind opening this facility, right? The NSA, and what are the pros? What might that help us with?
So the stated reasons, as far as I know, for the NSA facility, they say that they absolutely say that they're collecting all data on all other countries. So they have a database where they store all internet activity of anyone outside the U.S. And this database is for that. So the NSA is supposed to help, in theory, with intelligence outside the U.S. so that we can help keep the U.S. secure, so that we can monitor and figure out what China or Russia or Venezuela, Cuba, whatever, Iran, whatever they're up to. And so the NSA is tasked with that, with spying on, assisting in spying on that and gathering data, similar to the CIA. But they also say that one of their big things that they're looking to do is to promote safety among Americans, to be able to identify, for example, terrorists or traitors that are in our midst. And so they want to aggregate data so that they can stop a shooting before it happens, essentially. And so as an example of that, with the protests that were going on downtown here in Salt Lake City, the FBI with its database and the West Valley Police with their information, they were able to detect 2 men that were headed to the protests who were loaded with guns and ammunition. And they intercepted them on the way down to that protest and arrested these men. And so from their perspective, they're saying that they are making things safer and stopping these mass shootings and other things before they take place. And the NSA doesn't specifically currently, at least it doesn't claim to share that information with law enforcement. Because again, the NSA is claiming that they're not using any of this for criminal prosecutions. They're just saying it's for national security only. And they don't admit to monitoring U.S. citizens. They say that their activities are for outside of the U.S. But leaked documents from Edward Snowden and others show that the NSA absolutely has been collecting data on U.S. citizens and pursuing those things. So it gets, again, there's these issues where whenever there's power, if the government says, yeah, we need to come in and inspect your house beforehand, and we're just going to go come through and do an inspection of every American's home and determine who has enough ammunition in their house to do a mass shooting, they could justify that under safety. And then the question becomes for us as citizens. Obviously, there's risks to letting people do their thing and not having the government in every aspect of our life. But there's also great risk to giving the government power to access every part of our life. And there's a big balance. And some people say that they trust the government more. And some people say they trust private citizens more to make, to be able to work these things out. And yes, there will be some issues that come along. But that question is a good question because it really helps get to the heart of the debate and the struggle. Some people really want safety. And they feel we can be safer through the government having this information. And others view it as a huge, huge threat to freedom and
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I think it definitely, just like any issue or anything that we're presenting, I think we have to really do our due diligence as citizens to understand both sides of the argument.
For sure.
And understand that we are accepting responsibility and what we could be, the pros and cons, right? I think you could argue that point on both fronts.
Yeah, so and it is, and anyone on here, for sure, we love to hear both sides of it, because when we talk about both sides, we certainly become more educated to look at these things, understand what's happening. I want to go back to the Fourth Amendment really quickly. The Supreme Court has interpreted the Fourth Amendment to basically only apply if the government's pursuing a criminal prosecution. There's some.
Are they blistered now?
That's not entirely.
There are bubbles?
That doesn't hold entirely through.
That's kind of weird because it's not like you don't ever walk.
And it sounds like we have a caller who's not on mute and is talking. It's fine if.
I don't know how to pause this. I guess just turn the volume down.
Let's see. I can help you mute if you want.
Listening in on a thing about the Fourth Amendment or something. Just educational.
Let's see here.
Some kind of a thing against the government.
Sorry, I'll just, okay. Just help mute. So if you're on a call and you got muted and you need to talk, you can unmute for sure. But when we look at this, the Supreme Court, for the most part, has interpreted this to apply to criminal prosecutions only. And so it gets to an interesting issue that's coming up where the government says, okay, well, we'll use it for other purposes. We'll use it for safety or whatnot. And so looking at the text of this, the text itself doesn't say expressly that it's just for criminal prosecutions. But the Supreme Court, in looking at it, said, oh, we're talking about warrants and searches and seizures, and the government only does that if it's really concerned about a crime. And so they've kind of narrowed the scope of this to really focus on criminal aspects. And in the criminal realm, the government, the Supreme Court and courts have for a long time really enforced this. They wouldn't allow evidence to come in if they didn't have the warrants and things. But more and more in today's society, they are making exceptions to the Fourth Amendment where they allow for searches and seizures to take place when there's no warrant, when there's no probable cause. One example is the FTC has jurisdiction to enforce the consumer protection regulations, particularly those against fraudulent business advertising. And the courts currently allow the FTC to file a case in court, ask courts to shut down a business's, to freeze everything about a business, freeze their bank accounts, freeze all their assets, technology, everything. And the courts will issue these orders based upon the FTC just saying, yep, we believe that they're defrauding consumers. And the FTC will get this injunction in place, shut the business down before the business even knows what's happening, before they've even had a chance to respond in court. They serve the banks and their bank's account and things are frozen. And then the companies are left trying to prove that they didn't do something wrong at that point to get back to where they were. And it's a thing that's destroying a lot of businesses. In the end, if a business can figure out how to fight, meaning if they can find out ways to get money to pay an attorney and actually fight it, they often win. They often prevail in court, but they've been damaged extensively by the government's targeted attack on them. And in my opinion, that violates the Fourth Amendment. But the FTC, if they don't bring criminal charges against someone, they're allowed to do things like that. And again, it goes back to the Founding Fathers' concern, in my opinion, that if you have power, you start to use it wrongfully. That's just the sheer nature of power alone. And so in these situations, we certainly are in a society where we have technology. It can do pretty crazy things for good and bad. And we really need to figure out, I think, ways to help balance some of these interests. And so this is one where it gets really interesting. This company's created a lot of controversy for good and bad, but it's a real company here. And so can we ask, Elias, can you read that one for us?
Banjo is a private company committed to identifying problems in real time. Banjo, upon securing a contract with the state of Utah, relocated to Utah and began building its system with government funding. Banjo aggregates data from 911 calls, police reports, UDOT traffic cameras, public info on social media, and other public sources. Utah's Attorney General lobbied the legislature for additional funding for Banjo. Banjo now claims that it can identify a crime within seconds of it happening, or a fire as it starts, and alert police or firemen to respond before others call. Is a service violating the Fourth Amendment?
Okay, so curious about your thoughts on this with Banjo. The government has data, police reports, 911 reports, provides those to Banjo.
Austin, is Banjo just like outsourcing their contact tracing stuff that they're talking about?
Yeah, so basically Banjo, and this is where we get into the way the government's learning how to circumvent the Fourth Amendment, is that Banjo's a private company. They're a for-profit company. But Utah paid them to build this system. It was Utah's government money, taxpayer money, that then built the system for Banjo. The contact tracing, I don't think Banjo's been used yet for COVID areas, but they have advertised that they're very good at identifying a crime as soon as it's happening. For example, if someone's on Facebook Live and there's a gunshot heard in the background, Banjo listens to that, it hears that, Facebook Live's public, and it alerts it that there's a gun that went off. Then Banjo looks at all the other things around. If there's a 911 call that comes in shortly after, or if there's other people that suddenly their pattern of behavior changes, for example, if they have location data that they're tracking, then Banjo will go, oh, we believe there's been a shooting here. Police get there immediately. And they've managed to identify shootings like that within seconds of it happening based on the data that they aggregate. But curious to hear thoughts. John, what are your thoughts on this issue?
If I knew that this could be used by, that if people were completely moral and so forth, on the face of it, you could also almost make the claim that it is a great concept and a great thing to have. But the key is it allows them to track a lot of information on human behavior, and one of the things that it could do is help them get a competitive advantage above their competition in making things happen. They could sell the information, but let's just say that you're someone the government doesn't like, or like you said, there's a police officer that's unhappy with an interaction they had with you, or some government individual, or you have a brother-in-law that you happen to be on different political ends from them, and they call in and make a claim, or possibly even a false claim. It could put you in a bad situation. So that's kind of my, and also 20 years from now, I'm just going to say a concern that I have right now when it's going on social media. We have Black Lives Matter. Recently, we've heard we probably should use African Americans. Now we're hearing the term black again a lot. Well, which one do I use and be politically correct? And this can be used, this information might be able to be used for 15 years from now. They make a law, or they say something that is now perfectly legal becomes illegal. There's a lot of things that it can be manipulated with. So I'm a little all over the map, but there's a lot of points there, I think.
For sure. Banjo does bring up a lot of issues, and it is a good point. If you look even at things like the Me Too movement, where it's super important for us to stop sexual harassment and those types of issues. But what's happening right now is that the government is going back and they're extending these statute of limitations that applied to claims, and they're letting them be indefinite, essentially, where you can wait 40 years, 50 years, and then bring a claim against a company. And what happens, and what's happening to these companies and churches and other things right now, is that their response in 1970, if they responded in line with culture and norms and law of the day, they're being judged under today's standards for how a company should have responded. And suddenly they're now open to, hey, we're going to go back 40 years, and did you respond 40 years ago? Did you respond in line with our current standards? And to me, that's just an impossible hurdle to overcome. You know, how today are we obligated to look out and say, oh, all this is being recorded about me? Do I need to live according to standards 40 years from today or 50 years from today? And until this issue is a very real one, where it is happening, the government says, oh, there's some great injustice that's happened here, so we're going to go back in time, evaluate your past conduct according to current standards. And that is absolutely happening today. It's, you know, it's one reason, for example, that the scouting organization is totally, I mean, it's scouting is going down, and you know, they're in bankruptcy right now. They've got billions in lawsuits against them, but most of those lawsuits came as a result of these extended statute of limitations. And I'm not saying that the Boy Scouts did everything right, even, you know, many years ago. Not defending them, but it's more to say that churches are being evaluated. The misconduct alleged in the 70s and 80s is being evaluated according to today's standards. Even if you look at people in history, we view the founding fathers based on today's standards of conduct, and we evaluate it through that lens. And in some ways, we can't separate ourselves from that. But yeah, to John's point, if this information is just sitting there and you can come back and you use the wrong term, a term that becomes socially unacceptable in 15 or 20 years, but it was perfectly acceptable today, you know, what does that do to you? So these are some of the fascinating issues with data, with, you know, privacy and things. And Banjo here, there's two issues with Banjo. Banjo claims that all of its information is public information, that it collects, unless, I mean, the government is giving it some, so that side of it, but the information is collecting, it says it's public. People are putting it out there on their own. And the Supreme Court, with the Fourth Amendment, has determined that when you have a right to be secure in your persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, they've said if it's publicly available, then the government has every right to look at it too. So they're saying that the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to publicly available information. So Banjo says, yeah, we're just looking at public data. We're not spying on anyone, and we just aggregate it. And when we look at everyone in aggregate, we can determine what's happening very quickly. But they get to add in the benefit of police reports, UDOT traffic cameras. You know, they're getting to the place where cameras can track license plates, and they're getting machines that track license plates. They can identify exactly where a car is going, where it's traveling, just based on license plates cameras that are recording daily. Oh, yep, they're here, they're here, they're here, they're here. And a lot of this public info comes from cameras being installed everywhere. Where now, instead of,
Can I jump to something on how that might be applied that's just been recently in the news? I want to say it's not General Mattis, but there's a General Flynn had the FBI had information and transcripts of the conversations he had with the Russian ambassadors, and so how that and what they did, how they charged him is with basically not perjury, but something to that effect, that because you lied to us. Well, they had the information of exactly what he said, and if he didn't, because he didn't recall it completely, they said that he lied to them. So let's say you sit down with a police officer doesn't have to disclose to you that they're coming to you to investigate you for a crime. They come to you and say, hey, we want to kind of know where you've been today. there's someone that we believe that may be either in your organization or something along those lines, and they know exactly where you've been, and you say, well, I went here and I went here and I went here, but you leave three places out. And this conversation happens 2 months or 6 months after the actual day that it occurred. They can now use that information in saying that you are lying to them. That's how this information of them being able to gather that with your license plate data could put you in a real bind.
Yeah, and it's a great point. You know, I go back sometimes and I try and recreate my days, even just 3 days ago. And I go, can I, you know, I've actually done this a number of times. Can I put together 24 hours worth of what I was doing that day? And even looking at my phone calls, my emails, and I go back through and try and help myself. Even 3 days ago, I struggle remembering what I did. And it's pretty rare I can reconstruct an entire day of things. But again, if there's, you know, full access, it does start to create issues for us where there's a number of things that can start happening. And so with this, to me, one of the reasons I bring it up with technology is because even if we ban the government from doing it, other people are doing it. We're at a place where the power exists now, and companies can start to do all types of things. The government can start to do all types of things. Facebook alone is far bigger than anything in existence when this country was founded. You know, the founding fathers were afraid of a colony of, you know, these 13 colonies, and they were worried about the power corruption there. You know, Facebook has far eclipsed that. And currently in our legal system, we don't apply these constitutional principles to private companies. But it's interesting. One thing I've always been interested by is that the First Amendment, we don't have it here, but the First Amendment starts with Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech and other things. This one, though, doesn't say anything about Congress. The Fourth Amendment just says the right of the people to be secure shall not be violated. So it's a principle that I've always been curious about, to think, did the Founding Fathers intend for no one to have the right to just search and seize and do different things with us, or were they intending for it to only be Congress? And if they intended for it to only be Congress, why didn't they say that like they did in the First Amendment? Again, the Supreme Court's interpreted it to be it only applies to the state. But then we get to this issue of, well, if you're a private company but the government gave you money, does that money make you bound by the Fourth Amendment? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe you have any thoughts on whether the government's paying you for something, do you become a government actor at that point, or is it a private company?
I'd love to hear Ryan's thoughts on this. I always enjoy Ryan's thoughts.
Pressure's on. So I think just to me, I think once you accept those funds from the government, I think there should be stipulations set forth in that contract, right? And so to answer your question, Austin, I would probably have to say yes, but I can also, you know, see the benefit of these private companies, and I think there's definitely a lot of good that can be done. So that's a hard one.
And it certainly is, and there's no, you know, it gets really difficult because as you go down this rabbit hole, let's say that the government loans money to students, you know, federal loans, and these students go to Brigham Young University or Franciscan University in Steubenville, Catholic University. And so the university is receiving government funds. Does the university then, a private university, become bound to all the constitutional principles because it received private funds? And if that's the case, all of us just, the government mailed out stimulus checks to all Americans. And are we now bound by all the constitutional restrictions that the government is because there's, that there's government funds sitting there? And so it becomes an incredibly difficult line in principle to start to draw, because at the end of the day, if the government can restrict us and put additional restrictions on us by paying us money, they can buy a lot of our freedoms. But in the same vein, if there's no restriction on companies or people, the government can just outsource everything and circumvent a lot of the protections that are in place that were intended for us to stop the power, and the power becomes transferred through money.
So with that, Austin, why? Because Facebook and Google, they have to get your permission to collect your data. We don't read it, but when you say okay on the privacy agreements and everything, when you log into your Android phone for the first time, or your Apple phone, whatever, that's where it is. It says that they can record you, they can collect these things. So then why wouldn't Banjo have to do that? It seems like that would be an easier way to control these private companies working for the government. They should have to have, if it's our own personal information, shouldn't they have to have those approvals as well from us?
Yeah, so it's a good question. That all the information is determined to be, for Banjo's side of it, is they collect everything that we just put out there on our own. So if I go and I put up a website online for the world to see, then no one needs my permission to record that, to document the pictures and the text that are on there and all those things. I've put that out there. Facebook, Google, the reason that they have their terms of use that give them permission is that Facebook, people expect it to be just private. Facebook advertises this is a private setting. You can make it so only your friends see this. Well, if Facebook is recording it too and accessing it, then it's not just your friends. And so under the law, that becomes basically fraud. Where Google says, oh yeah, you can email, and this email just goes to one person. Well, it's not true that it just goes to one person. The email that Google is sending is going to Google and the one person we sent it to. And so those companies at that point, to not be considered fraudulent under the law, and the law has passed some data privacy laws. There are some out there. And so to comply with those and data that we expect to maintain privacy and that we're not saying it's publicly available to everyone, they have to get our permission to collect that. But the law also says that anything that we give permission to in contract, we can waive any constitutional right, they say. We can waive any right we have, we just have to sign it away. And so these companies just slap some terms of use there to protect themselves against the fraud claims or the non-disclosure claims and those other things that can arise. And so it's a good question, but Banjo hasn't gone that route because they know that a lot of people won't want to aggregate their data. Well, at least in the past, before coronavirus, people didn't want to. Now a lot of people are into aggregating their data voluntarily, giving out their location and these other things. But it gets to your point earlier about Google had let us on to believe that our location data was private. And suddenly Google's taken the step to say, oh, well, government, we're going to share it with you so that you can aggregate it and see who's violating your lockdown orders and who's violating quarantine orders and things. And they just released our location data, and they're attempting to avoid lawsuits by saying, well, we removed all personally identifiable information from it. I said, it's just, we don't tell them that Austin was here. We just tell them a person was here. And so Austin, we haven't violated our terms and conditions to you. But again, it's a fascinating issue to look at. We'll get into going on down another one here. in this same one, the government, the NSA, went through when it began its surveillance program on American citizens, and this one is publicly known. They don't deny this one anymore. They started aggregating data of phone calls. That was their first tracking the NSA did. And they actually went to the 4 large phone carriers. They didn't force these phone carriers to install them. At least, you know, I don't know what, if there were threats or whatever else. I don't know about that. But they took these and said, hey, you have phone data. And they said, we won't record the content of the calls. We just want the general information about who's calling, when they're calling, how long it lasted, who they were talking to. And the NSA during this program, they paid AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, I think, Sprint. I don't remember. There were 4 large ones that they paid, and the NSA actually paid these companies to give them this data. And the NSA collected a database of over 2 trillion phone calls of American citizens, but they purchased the data. They paid for it. So then it gets the question of, well, is that an unreasonable search or seizure when these companies sell data? You know, it's things in our terms and conditions. We said, yeah, you can sell this, go ahead. And they'd sell it, but they sell it to the government. So what are your thoughts on that? Is that in line with the 4th Amendment? Are we getting to the point where we're now circumventing the 4th Amendment? Because again, the companies can sell it to any other private company. So just curious if any of you have thoughts there.
This is one of those things that it's a double-edged sword. I can see how it's perceived that, yes, the government has the right to do this because they're acting, there is the corporation of the United States now, especially. And so the government has the right to act as a business, to go and purchase things just like any other business does, especially when if it's perceived that it's okay for them to do this. But I don't think it's in line with what our founding fathers wanted or thought something that they would have wanted to occur. So if you make a contract with someone, maybe it goes even back to your previous conversations of full knowledge of the contract. Obviously, many people don't know what it means. So, but you contracted that you would do that. I can see both sides, but for me personally, I think the government needs to be held to a higher standard, and the government wants to claim they get to have the same standard. And like I said, I think our founders would have said no.
Well, and I appreciate those thoughts. One thing I also wonder about is what our founding fathers would have thought about terms of use, you know, these click, where they were claimed to consent because we click on something, but you know, are we truly? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be responsible for what we choose to do, but at the end of the day, if I need a phone to function in society, to run a business, just to pursue the daily things of life, you know, I can choose, do I want Google spying on me or Apple spying on me? I mean, that's basically my 2 decisions at that point. And so can I make an informed choice on that? Yeah, but what happens when both of them say the same things and look at these same? Do I really have a choice then about whether I want to protect my privacy or not? And again, there's apps that are worse than other apps, and we can make decisions based on those. But at the end of the day, my phone is absolutely tracking me, and I have no power whatsoever to turn it off, turn off the tracking, other than just to not use a phone, which again is in theory, it's an option, but in today's society, with how it works, you know, how feasible is it for a business owner or others to do that? So it gets us to an interesting place here with conflicts in our current way of life.
Austin,
Yep.
just to be a participant in this discussion, I had to say that I would allow this meeting to be recorded.
Yep.
So did I really want to relinquish, you know, this discussion to be held by this company and possibly by the government? No. But I couldn't be a part of your discussion without giving it. So they just have everyone over a barrel every time you want to be a participant in your world.
Yeah. And it comes down to, it's a great point, you know, of this, of even saying, yeah, these will be available. So can you have a private discussion? You know, will it be, can we talk about the Fourth Amendment offline? Well, obviously there's convenience here to meeting online. But, you know, yeah, to the point of, at some point, in my opinion, we get to a place where it's not true that we've fully consented. At some point, it's becoming coerced that we accept things because we have to learn, or we have to go to the store, or we have to do other things. And you had asked the question, you had sent this to me. I thought it was a good question. If the government went door to door to collect COVID-19 data, would that be an infringement of the Fourth Amendment? And I can tell you under, just to give a straight up answer to that, the Supreme Court would say no, so long as you have the ability to say no to it. And so the government's, every police officers can come to your door, they can knock on it, and they can say, can we search your house? They can say, there's a child that's been kidnapped in the neighborhood, can we come in and search your house? And whether or not there has been a kid kidnapped, I don't know. But if you consent, then the Supreme Court absolutely allows it. So I did want to address that question, but I do appreciate the point too, with, again, going back to consent, the very basis of it, of how do we interact in this world when other people set the terms and conditions constantly, and if we just say no to everything, then we're just left there in isolation. So this is just an interesting one to look at quickly with Ancestry.com. They do these DNA tests. You can view your family heritage. It's pretty neat to check out your family heritage. But what law enforcement's realized is, yeah, they say we don't have a full database of DNA of every American. And when they collect DNA from a crime scene, they then just send a subpoena to Ancestry and say, hey, this is the DNA, and you're required to produce any records you have that might go along with this. And these companies, MyHeritage or Ancestry or others that collect these DNA samples, they're often required to send back matching DNA samples. And people have been arrested for crimes because they had submitted DNA to Ancestry. Or the other thing that happens are cousins of criminals get arrested because their DNA is really close and it looks the same. And there are documented cases of people that submitted things to Ancestry. They had a cousin commit a crime, leave DNA on scene, and the cousin gets arrested for it. We won't have time to, we won't go through this in great detail. Again, it's just highlighting this interplay, this power struggle between private companies that collect things that can do neat things. I think it's great for people to know their family heritage. But then what happens when the government starts taking that, or Ancestry starts selling that? If they're selling it to people, what happens then? And so going to the coronavirus quickly too, this is a rumor that, maybe I shouldn't say a rumor. This is, some people contend that the legislature is meeting next week to talk about this. Some other people say they're not. So I don't have full facts. There's people that very much say this is happening, but I also know people that say people have interpreted it wrong and it's not happening exactly as they say. But whether or not it's happening next week, I think that it's certainly coming, and a lot of people are talking about it. And so if they pass a law requiring that you be tested for coronavirus, and you can't go into a business unless you've been tested, and you can't go back to work unless you've been tested, and these things. And then they also, what if they say, well, when we now have a coronavirus vaccination here, and so we're going to pass a law that says you can't go out in public unless you've been vaccinated against coronavirus. This gets to Angela's question. The government creates a card that we can carry around in our wallet that says, yep, I've been vaccinated. And then you have to show these to get into a business. Is this getting into unreasonable search and seizure area, violating the Fourth Amendment, or not? Again, these are tough questions. We present the questions because I think at the end of the day, the thing it really forces us to do deep inside is to say, where am I at in my belief of freedom, of power of the government, the ability for power to corrupt and do these things, or my ability to take risk in life that maybe everyone won't be vaccinated against coronavirus. Do I have the right as an individual to demand that the rest of the country do something so that I feel safe? Are we starting to get into issues? And there's other amendments, other constitutional provisions that could be explored as well. But the fascinating thing that's happening here is that the government is, again, they're going to business to find kind of a way to not follow the Fourth Amendment. And for example, in Utah and Salt Lake County, when businesses first opened back up, they said, okay, we're not going to pass a law that requires all Utahns to wear a mask, but we will say businesses that reopened that were considered a higher risk, you're required to make sure that every one of your customers has a mask. And so people aren't allowed to come to your store unless they're wearing a mask. And so they shifted the compliance burden to businesses. And yes, I can say I don't have to go to that store or that business. I have that freedom. But at the end of the day, if the health department tells all businesses, you have to require that people wear masks and you have to require that people be vaccinated, then they can put on this front that, well, as a citizen, you still have a choice. It's kind of like with Google and Apple right now. You still have a choice. You don't have to sign those terms of use. And they can say, well, you have a choice. You don't have to be vaccinated. You don't have to be tested, but you can't go to the business. You can't walk in there. You can't get the things you need. And we're very much trending towards that right now, where the government has taken this intermediary approach where it won't regulate us directly, but it regulates business. And it won't collect data on us directly, but it absolutely allows businesses to aggregate that data. And then it just takes the data from the businesses. So in my opinion, we're at a place where the principles of the Fourth Amendment are being radically undermined very quickly in this context of, I call it an illusion of consent. We're not really consenting anymore. And at some point, again, at the beginning, there is consent, but at some point it becomes so widespread and pervasive that it's no longer consent. And we're no longer free to make decisions. John, did you have a thought with that?
I think you stated it well, very well there, that so if you'll go back to that thing that you just had up, the slide before this, that was going to be my main comment. Can we really give consent? Bottom line is, if I want to do business in today's world as being a sales guy, I'm expected to have a cell phone with me. I'm expected to be able to look at my email within an hour or two by most of my clients. And if I don't get back to them within a couple hours, then it really hurts my ability to do business. So how free am I really? Then my understandings from what I just have gathered very recently, the whole legislature is not meeting, but there is a committee that's meeting, and that is one of their talking points is the coronavirus. But what happens is at these meetings, they will say we've completely vetted out all the concerns, and everybody agrees. And so there's very little, if no, discussion when it comes up for vote in the final session. So these legislative committees, especially on things like this, are pretty intensive. Philadelphia passed a law just recently that they will not allow any coronavirus restrictions. So that's something to keep in mind, and maybe to talk. I'm sure that on this call, there's probably got to be a person or two that actually likes the idea, but of the coronavirus tracking. I have friends that do. So go ahead and go to the next slide, and I'll shut up so we can finish up.
And I appreciate that. And again, the coronavirus one, again, it highlights this thing of, yeah, there's a lot of power to stop the spread of disease. And if you just go to that principle alone, technology can be used to stop the spread of disease. The problem I think that happens is that if the government puts out one good reason or one good thing it can do, a lot of people buy off on it because they say, well, yeah, I want to do that. Yes, we're all good moral people. I'm not opposed necessarily to just the sheer principle alone of stopping the spread of disease. But what happens and what's happening, and this is a constant thing that we don't discuss often, is once the power and the precedent is there, if we have no checks and balances on, let's even assume that the government was just, there were no ill actors in the government, no anything, it was just pure straight up, out of the goodness of everybody's heart, they want to stop coronavirus. Even if that's the case and coronavirus goes great and there's no abuses that come from it, there's a precedent set that the government can now do this with emergencies or other things. And we haven't taken the time as a society to talk about, well, how do we check that power now that it exists? How do we check the contact tracing power and check these other powers? Because again, the people of England, the king's people could show, I'm sure, that they found criminals and they found traitors and they found these other people through these searches. And there's always something good that happens with it. But there's also some serious abuses of power that lead to some very bad places. And in our society right now, as we go down this path, technology, in my opinion, is rapidly advancing. There's all kinds of good things that can come from it. But we're just not having the discussion about, okay, but how do we then stop someone from using that for wrong? And just to give a quick example, I have a cousin who's researching how to actually reprogram the brain to help people heal from traumatic events. And they have a very good purpose with it. But I did ask him, I said, if you can actually reprogram the brain to think good things, I said, couldn't they do the exact same thing that makes someone think bad things? Now that power's there. And he said, well, he just looked at me confused and he goes, well, yeah, someone could do that. He says, but none of us are pursuing it for that reason. And I agree that him and the others have great hearts. They want to help. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at how to do things like that necessarily. But we just don't have the discussion about, well, yeah, you may have a good heart, but there's other people with bad hearts, and then how we get to that place. So we are over on time here. So we'll just go to the last slide quickly, see if this will go down. I think an important concept is to recognize that privacy is not to protect criminals. Privacy is an important check on government power. The founding fathers didn't give us privacy rights to protect criminals. It was absolutely necessary to check abuses of power. I think we need to seriously look at and talk about how to balance these powers, how to put some checks and balances in place with technology. How do we look at that? And do constitutional protections even need to come down into private companies at this point to start to check some of these abuses of power, because it's so easy for the government to circumvent things. We always need to understand that even with a good outcome or a good stated purpose, the more good something can do, generally the more bad something can do. And so if we're going to pursue something that can bring about great good, and really help, such as stopping mass shootings or whatever, we have to look at then what else that could be used for if we're going to allow that power to exist, and really weigh these benefits and consequences to say, we might have to tolerate certain risks or things in society. And I think ultimately we really need to be vigilant about telling our government officials we do not support mandatory searches of all Utahns. To me, that's a very dangerous principle. If we get into the realm of setting a precedent that the government can require mandatory searches of everybody, even requiring it through businesses, we're quickly going to a very dangerous place. And there's other ways to address concerns. There's other ways to look at issues that are far more respective of freedoms. And I would suggest that we take a hard line there. But those are some of my takeaways from this. Like I say, we're all here to learn and grow, and hopefully this discussion helps you think. And hopefully it's not a fearful one. It's more meant to just promote thought, to say, let's start talking about it. Let's start talking about what this looks like. Let's start thinking of ways to put checks and balances in place. Founding fathers couldn't anticipate technology, and this is one area where I believe as good people we need to come together and say, this is how we implement checks and balances on technology and the potentials to help curb some of the imbalances of power that can come. So we'll continue next week talking some more about this, but appreciate your time today. And if you have any questions or anything, you can feel free to email me or follow up with me offline as well. So have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Talk to you later.
Let's do a quick chat.
Okay.
We can do it on our cell phones or whatnot, whatever works for you.
Yeah, I'll give you a call in a minute here.
Okay. Bye.